Some researchers, as well as contemporaries of the promiscuous emperor, are sure that his mother made him like that. Agrippina, an ambitious and domineering woman, never showed her son motherly feelings, was cold to him, and was generally not interested in her son. Moreover, the mother categorically did not accept Nero's passion for music, poetry, wood carving, and art at all. The child had a really vivid and inquisitive mind, but, in Agrippina's opinion, it was completely foreign to the future emperor. Therefore, the boy was actually forced against his will to forget about his passions and do what his mother thought was right. You're watching Flip Side of History, and today we will tell you about things which took place during the reign of Emperor Nero. Agrippina was constantly engaged in palace intrigues, quarrels, and disputes with undesirable or even dangerous people. The young Nero, observing all this with his own eyes, soon began to take part in palace intrigues himself, gradually turning from an inquisitive and kind boy into a ruthless schemer with no sense of conscience or dignity. When Agrippina poisoned her husband, the 3-year-old Nero became a full-fledged candidate for emperor, who later, after growing up in accordance with family traditions, got rid of his mother. But at first he poisoned his adoptive father, Emperor Claudius, who had adopted Nero after the death of his own father, and his mother's disposal was the result of her interference in her son's private life. When Nero fell in love with the daughter of a noble Roman dignitary, Poppaea Sabina, the girl, proud of the fact that the emperor himself had paid attention to her, already dreamed of becoming an empress. Realizing that this would lead to the loss of power, Agrippina managed, or at least tried, to seduce her own son. Some contemporaries asserted that the attempt failed, while others said that an act of incest had occurred. In any case, this caused a great deal of disturbance in Rome, and Poppaea herself demanded that her lover get rid of his inadequate mother. Thus Nero, realizing his mother's influence in Rome, tried twice to pursue relatively legal options to remove her from the throne. The first, an accusation of conspiracy against the emperor. It failed. The second, an attempt to stage an accident on the water, also ended in failure. In the end, Agrippina was simply stabbed to death by Roman soldiers. Before his mother's assassination, it is worth noting that Nero was respected by the Senate and the Romans themselves. Under him, schools began to be built, the repression of officials and dissatisfied senators ceased. In general, life in the Roman Empire was quite peaceful, secure, and honorable. But after the murder, Nero was reborn as the monster that both his contemporaries and historians of the past centuries wrote about with hatred and disgust. Nero's love adventures. Ancient Roman Empire was notorious for its tolerant attitude to amusement, but the excesses of Nero shocked even citizens who were accustomed to everything. For example, the emperor, wrapped in the skin of an animal, pounced on his victims tied to poles and sexually assaulted them. The victims were of both sexes. For a time, the amorous emperor was even married to his slave, the boy Spore. This is what one of Nero's contemporaries, Suetonius, wrote about it. He married him with all the ceremonies, with a dowry and a torch, took him into his house with great pomp, and lived with him as his wife. I still remember someone's good joke: how happy would people be if Nero's father had such a wife? When Nero became bored with the role of Spore's husband, he decided to marry again. The chosen one was a freed slave of Doryphorus. This prank, which trampled all possible foundations of the family, no longer just stunned the Romans. It was outrageous. But the emperor cared the least for the indignant citizens. He amused himself as much as he could. The historian Tacitus, a contemporary of Nero, left this characterization of the emperor for future generations. Nero himself indulged in debauchery, not distinguishing between the permissible and the impermissible. There seemed to be no vulgarity in which he could show himself more depraved. But after a few days he entered into marriage, furnishing it with solemn wedding ceremonies. However, even those of his contemporaries believed that such outbursts during the reign of Nero were not the most terrible thing. Nero had many innocent victims on his conscience, including his own family members. His official wife Poppaea gave birth to a daughter who, unfortunately, did not live to the age of 1 year. Having lost all her beauty, the woman reasonably feared that sooner or later her amorous husband would get rid of her, It seemed that Poppaea's second pregnancy would put things right, but Nero was clearly becoming impatient with his wife. And one day, in a rage, he punched her in the stomach with such force that Poppaea died, with the child under her heart. Nero entertained himself by dressing as a slave and strolling around Rome's most disreputable establishments. His guards, also dressed as slaves, would beat up random passerby, rob a store, or even satisfy their lust. The emperor himself, understandably, was not left out either. Finally, Nero wholeheartedly gave himself to an occupation that was considered unworthy for a free citizen. Let's say dramatics and acting. Absolutely no regard for any rules and regulations, the emperor himself spoke on the theatrical stage and sometimes even forced to be actors the most noble greats and senators. Refusal meant imminent death, which could have struck the unfortunate at the most unexpected moment. Terror and praise. But the most outspoken of bacchanalia began after Nero's tutor, the philosopher Seneca, committed suicide by order of the emperor. Sophonicus Tigellinus, who had been given the title of the vilest bastard of the time, took his place. Quickly realizing the weaknesses of Nero, Sophonicus became an associate of the emperor in all his licentious feasts and orgies, and gradually restructured the internal policy of Rome, so that now the main attention was paid only to the preservation of the emperor's majesty. Ongoing show-off trials were held against those who, in the opinion of the authorities, had in one way or another attempted to encroach on the emperor's greatness. The sentences were almost invariably the death penalty. Terror automatically led to the blossoming of snitching. At this time in the imperial palace there were no longer mere bacchanalian excesses, but rather madness. Unrestrained drunkenness, sexual promiscuity and sexual perversion became the norm. Morality was not regarded as something important anymore. Even today it is impossible to enumerate the amusements that Nero organized. So dissatisfaction with the rule grew so fast that it may have driven the emperor to his most insane act. Now, Great Fire. As a consequence of Nero's most gruesome action, many Christians were also subjected to mass repression. The beginning of the high-profile trial of the two apostles, Peter and Paul, as well as dozens of other advocates of Christianity, was the famous fire in Rome. However, the accusation of Christians in the lighting of Rome in mass executions had no effect whatsoever. After everything, Romans did not believe in the guilt of Christians, but many contemporaries believed that the fire was organized by Nero himself. The rumor was strengthened after the restoration of the city on the site of the old palace began to build an immensely luxurious golden house, which became the real spit to the recent fire victims. Despite being built anew and quite competently, despite the fact that food and necessities were sent from the nearest cities by order of the emperor, the Romans could no longer believe in the emperor's innocence. Trust was broken completely. But the machinery of terror that had been created made it possible to deal with all the discontented without too much difficulty. They executed them in the most sophisticated ways. For example, they sewed them into animal skins and threw them to the dogs, or made living torches out of the condemned. Those doomed to die in the fire were set on fire as darkness fell for the sake of night lighting. It's obvious that it could not go on like this for long, and in the end, his most loyal troops, the Praetorians, rebelled against Nero. On hearing this news, Nero fled Rome in cowardice. After all, deprivation of support of Praetorians meant an automatic collapse, the beginning of which was the decision of the Senate to outlaw Nero. It was ordered to bring the emperor to Rome and publicly flog him to death. Nero himself could not stand physical pain, even though he had condemned thousands of people to it during his reign. And realizing what awaited him, one of the most depraved, vicious and cruel emperors in all of Roman history committed suicide by jamming a dagger into his throat. Although some historians are sure that the emperor himself, being a coward at heart, did not dare to do such a thing, it was a secretary who helped him to end his life. In the last moments of his life, already hearing the hum of the footsteps of the guards who were coming to arrest Nero, the emperor found the strength to quote Homer. The soldiers sent to arrest him were approaching. This aesthete could not resist quoting Homer. the horses that gallop, their stomping disturbs my ears. Thank you for watching our video. Subscribe to the channel and don't hesitate to leave a like.